Hello, once again, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us for this Georgia Climate Digest video interview series. Everyone, please meet Daniel Parson. Daniel is an organic farmer and educator. It is great to be with you today, Daniel. Thank you for being here.
Well, thank you for having me.
Daniel, so why don't we jump right in and you go ahead and please introduce yourself to our audience and tell us about the work that you do.
Well, I'm Daniel Parson. I'm a farmer educator. And for the last 12 years, I've been running a college farm here in Georgia. And before that, I've been farming in the Piedmont region of Georgia or South Carolina since 1998. So started up in Dawsonville, then went back for a master's at Clemson University. And then I was in Atlanta for a number of years at Gaia Gardens, and then in upstate South Carolina. And now I'm back in Georgia.
So let's jump right in. Climate smart agriculture. We know that is one of the 20 climate solutions that Drawdown Georgia is committed to and wants to educate the citizens in Georgia about. So can you explain exactly what climate smart agriculture is and what it looks like on a Georgia farm?
Well, I've been doing this long enough that it's the new buzzword for what we've been doing for a long time. As far as I know, the first thing is to produce a lot of food on a small area, because we know that efficient production is really helpful in terms of all environmental impacts of agriculture. So, that's our first thing, is produce a lot in a small space. And the other thing is to reduce our impact on the climate. And third would be to reduce the climate's impact on our crops. And when I say it's the way I've been doing it since I started, that's one of the big things of organic agriculture, is to mitigate those impacts of weather and climate on our crops and to reduce that risk.
So when we're talking, that's so interesting that you mentioned, and I'm not by any means a farmer, and would love, and I've talked to my husband and my mom about, growing a few things on, in our backyard or whatever. It's part of my dream. But when you talk about growing a lot in a small area, I feel like I've heard a lot about kind of what that looks like when it comes to a lot of people say that they, I would love to grow this or this, and people think that they don't know how to get started because they think they need a whole bunch of space.
Right.
What the little bit of space you have and being able to produce a lot in that small little area.
Yeah. So with organic farming, I think that when I started, people had the notion that it was not as productive as conventional agriculture. And we've really turned that around. And Rodale has done a lot of research on this. One of the things on their long-term study, they found that conventional agriculture can be more productive than organic agriculture on the good years. But when the weather is not as good, that's when the organic farms really excel and exceed expectations. And so growing a lot in a small space is about providing what the plants need for their growth. And so I always say with vegetables, you want them to take off like a rocket ship. You don't want any bumps in the road as far as things that'll slow them down, because vegetables are like workhorses. You're turning that sunlight into edible plant material. And so you want to have everything they need. And it's the basics from the soil. They get the fertility nutrients that they need. They get the water, the oxygen the roots need to function, and then the sunlight. And so our challenges then come on the other side of things with pest pressure and weather issues and diseases and weeds, of course, being those challenges that come along. So it's all about mitigating those. And with organic farming, we don't have as many tools to intervene when issues occur. So we do a lot to solve those problems before they happen. And, part of that is the changing weather patterns. And so, just to give an example, we use a lot of cover cropping. So crop rotation and cover crops use are really the cornerstones of our system. When I say cover crop, that's a crop grown to actually plow into the soil to add nutrients to the next generation. And so during the summer, we may have a field that we're not growing a cash crop in, and instead we're growing buckwheat for the flowers, we're growing cowpeas for the nitrogen, and we're growing sorghum seed and grass to pull that carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and turn it into organic matter that goes into the soil. Growing those cover crops really help with pulling that carbon into the soil. Now, when we plow it in to prepare for our cash crop, it's also released. So there's a downside to that as well, but it leads to greater production when you have more organic matter in the soil. And if you have plenty of organic matter, if you get more rain, it will absorb it and lead to less runoff. If you get less rain, it will hold that moisture for your plants. If you have nutrients like the nitrogen from the cowpeas that are in your soil, that organic matter will hold onto it and release it to the plants. And so that organic matter in the soil does so much for our plants. It's kind of that magic bullet for us.
Right. That's so great. Thank you for explaining that. So you talked about cover cropping. You talked about some of the other practices that you use in organic farming or climate smart funding, excuse me. And I think you mentioned a few practices that are different from traditional ag, as you mentioned. And then, of course, we know with Drawdown, Georgia, and with the climate smart agriculture, there's also a conversation around tillage or reduced tillage, less tillage, using less tilling or tilling less. So these types of practices, like the cover cropping, like the reduced tillage, how do these practices help build soil health over time? How does soil actually capture and store carbon in a climate smart way using these types of practices?
Well, so I have to come clean and tell you that we do some tillage. And so part of that is the first thing, which is growing a good crop. And so to grow, for us to grow a good vegetable crop in a small space, tillage is part of our system. But in terms of soil health, the number one thing is living plant roots. And so when you have a cover crop in the field, you've got that. When you have a crop in the field, you've got that as well. And sometimes we can combine them, have cover crops growing alongside our cash crops, but not always. And then you're pulling that carbon into the plant. That's plant's superpower, right? Is to fix carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. That's what they do best. And so then when you terminate that cover crop, then you've got that carbon goes back into the soil and feeds the soil that way. And so the second best thing for soil health is that organic matter, the dead plant material. So cover crops really do both of those things.
Got it. And we know there's a lot of, it sounds like you're talking about also composting when it comes to the dead plant material. And so we know there's a lot of emphasis on composting. That's something that a lot of people are familiar with. So you mentioned practices, you mentioned some of the ways in which you all work on this type of farming or this type of agriculture. What equipment, what labor changes are needed to add and adopt some of these practices into our agriculture, whether that be big or small scale?
Yeah, one of the first things you need is to have a crop rotation. And so, it's interesting about agriculture. We tend to think of everything in silos of like, okay, this is organic agriculture, this is sustainable, this is climate smart, this is conventional. The reality is that any farmer can pretty much use any of these tools. Now, for certified organic farming, we take some of the tools off of the table that conventional farmers have. So any of these practices really can be used by any grower. And a lot of growers do use crop rotation, but not everybody uses cover crops. And part of it for us being vegetable growers is that we bring a lot higher value off of an acre of produce than say somebody growing wheat, or a row crop. They may be looking at hundreds of dollars per acre, and a small vegetable grower would be looking at more like tens of thousands per acre. And so we can actually spend money on things like cover crop seed more readily, but lots of farmers can use cover crops. They're really great for if you're growing summer crops every year. It holds the soil during the winter. There's lots of reasons to do it. In terms of like labor and equipment, one, it's that organization around the rotations and then having the labor to plant the cover crop and having the equipment to do that with. And then how are you going to deal with it on the other end once you've grown that cover crop? So for us, that's a flail mower and disc to get it plowed in. If you're using no-till, that would be maybe a roller crimper to roll it down. And that's something that I've wanted to do, but I haven't had the roller crimper equipment. And of course, you can't grow everything that way. So it would work really well with squash and tomatoes and pumpkins, but virtually impossible to grow carrots no-till.
We talked about carbon capture. We talked about how we're mentioning carbon when it comes to growing vegetables and, what plants do for carbon and vice versa. What are some of those benefits or some of the other benefits of climate smart agriculture or organic farming for farmers? Can they be lower input costs over time or improve resilience during droughts or heavy rain? Or what are the other benefits that farmers can find with this?
Yeah, the number one thing on my mind is that resilience. Because we have even a normal year has lots of different weather occurring. And so we need that kind of insurance against those things that can occur. And so the things like reducing runoff are major benefits to us, and soil being able to hold water at a higher capacity is huge for us. And the diversity of our plantings goes along with that as well. With climate change, it's not just a lengthening of season. I mean, some people think of it that way. They think, oh, well, it's, global warming, we're going to have a longer season. And the season is creeping slightly longer. But in my experience, we've had our last frost in the spring or our first frost in the fall can be just as late in the spring and just as early in the fall as we've seen it. Because it's the unpredictability of the weather is increasing. Right. And so that resilience gets more and more important as time goes on. And that's one of the main things that it does for us. I say, we're talking about weather. I've often said, well, if you had a hailstorm in May, that's about the worst thing that could happen. And we definitely lost some crops, maybe one or two crops were lost. Some of them were affected, but others were completely unaffected. And that's partly because of the diversity that we grow and that diversity of timing that it's actually in the ground. But also things like the rotation and cover crops play into that. So, if we were growing one crop that was in the ground that May, we might have lost it all. But because we had some that were ready to be planted and some that were younger and all that, we were able to survive that a little bit better. And it's true of all the weather events we've seen, is that resilience comes from different methods.
Yeah, we had Dr. Marshall Shepard, climate scientist, on a couple episodes ago, and I think it was him who described it this way of like weather being, your emotions versus climate being your personality. Like, what does that mean? How does that change?
Yeah.
How you mentioned the frost being earlier or the frost being, last frost being later in the spring.
Yeah. And that's the thing, is that without that predictability, we can't really do things differently. So I learned the difference between climate and weather from a climate scientist in Georgia who was just doing one of his regular talks in the state. And he was explaining the difference between the two and talked about the upcoming winter. And that year, the upcoming winter was predicted to be warm relatively. And so there were a lot of farmers in the room, and we were all like, oh, this is great. We'll plant some late things because they'll do well, because, lettuce in December can be very harvestable outside, or it can get too cold early. And then in January, often it's too cold by then. But if you have a nice warm winter, you're fine. Well, a bunch of us planted a little bit extra, and then we got severe cold in December.
Oh my goodness.
And so we all felt the same way about what we had heard. But it really illustrated the difference between climate and weather, because indeed it was a warm winter. But we happened to have unusual cold in mid-December. And so we respond to the weather, but we're also part of the climate. And so with our frost-free date being somewhere in early to mid-April, we don't know if that last frost is going to come in as early as February or as late as that date of mid-April. We really don't know. So yeah, we got to mitigate those differences.
And I know that can be frustrating. So speaking of frustrating and challenges, my daughter is born in July, and I'm always interested. For the last 2 or 3 years, she's 5 now. For the last 2 or 3 years, I've been wanting to take her blueberry picking.
Yeah.
Because blueberries are supposed to be, prominent in July. So, and I know she would love it, and she loves blueberries. And I've called around to a couple of farms in the last couple of years, and very quickly they've said, oh, we're out, before they could even open up.
Wow.
We're already out of blueberries, because of the changing climate. Birds are here later or earlier than they're supposed to be. And so all the, animals have cleaned us out, or we don't have as many as we normally do. And so these big farms that typically open up their farms to people to come and do blueberry picking, and I'm sure other crops obviously as well, don't have that business even.
Yeah.
So speaking of challenges and frustrations on when and how to crop, what are the other challenges? Are there any other challenges that we'll face when transitioning to these agricultural practices based on some of these differences in climate?
Yeah.
Yields, like you mentioned with the lettuce, and other costs.
I think that cost of using cover crops, cover crop seed and equipment needed are some of the challenges in switching over. And I mean, farmers are particularly challenged with changes because there are so many risk factors involved with farming. And when you've done it the same way and had success, it's really hard to try something different in hopes of success. And so I think that's always a barrier for farmers to make changes. And then, like the equipment, like I said, I've wanted to do no-till farming for some time, but not having the equipment and not knowing how it's going to work, and that it would just be a small portion of our crop that we think would be successful. It's just been hard to make that switch. But there are a lot of things we can do. I mean, with part of it being that increased production and mitigating the effects of climate, both of those things are primary goals for every farmer. We're all dealing with the weather, and we're all wanting to produce more on the land that we have. Those are easy goals to attach to encourage farmers to switch to different practices.
So if folks are listening to this, they're watching this, they're interested in doing more climate smart agriculture, more organic farming, what's the easiest first step for people? For a Georgia farmer who's curious about the climate smart agriculture piece and the practices that go into that, what's the easiest first step that people can implement?
That's a great question. And I would say, cover crops. That would be my first thing, is that's an easy step to take. And I think I would look at if there was a place for no-till within the operation. Those would be places to start. And if you're not doing a crop rotation, definitely get started with that, because that just helps you plan out everything else. Right. And I think, there's one thing that we haven't touched on, which is really important for all the environmental impacts of agriculture, is food waste. Food waste is probably the number one thing. And so I feel like small farms that go to farmers markets or have community supported agriculture programs are really part of that solution, because if you're a farmers market shopper, you probably go to market every week and you're buying fresh, you're buying what you need, and you go next week. And if you've still got something in your fridge, you use that before you buy new ones. And also you're getting it fresh. Most farmers doing farmers markets have another outlet midweek. So you're often getting things that are harvested sometimes on that Friday for Saturday. And so buying local is one of the great things you can do to reduce that food waste too.
Thank you for mentioning food waste, because I think, like I said, I mentioned about composting and other ways that we're thinking about. And we talked about crops in a few different ways on this show. And so I think that's a really important point that you're making there.
I think it's a good focus for consumers to think about food waste. And, the other thing with consumers is really just thinking about where your food is coming from. But young people coming up have kind of the same reaction that people did that I had 28 years ago or when I started was, oh, where is this food coming from? I thought, I see cows in the pastures of Georgia, and I thought my ground beef in the grocery store was coming from those cows. But then I found out, they get shipped out west and all that. It's really different from what you might think about. And, you may know you've got vegetable farms in your area, but you're not necessarily eating from those farms. And so I think for consumers, the first step is knowing where your food comes from and being closer to that producer. And that way you can make choices that have an influence on climate and things that you might care about.
That's so important, and something that I've been trying to think about more, but you're right. I think we're done a disservice when it comes to the way that our food gets to us, and not really teaching what like farm to table actually means, and where that food that is on your plate, like you mentioned, is coming from. And I also think that the point that you made about, we see, if you drive through Georgia, you see, cows, or you see farms, assuming your food is coming from there. And it's very easy for folks to think in an agricultural state like Georgia that, of course, the food that I'm getting is coming from in a place that I live that seems to be so abundant in things that I have in my refrigerator all the time. But that's not necessarily the case if you actually look at the packaging, which I do, and see that a lot of, fruits and veggies that we get are coming from, California.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So for the folks that are wanting to dig into some of these practices and think about these things, what are the grants, loans, cost share programs that you know of in Georgia that can help farmers get started in making some of these transitions that you mentioned?
Some of the resources I point to is, of course, Georgia Organics is a statewide nonprofit, and they've been working with organic farmers and other sustainable farmers. They're not just for certified organic folks. Also, the USDA Sustainable Agriculture Research and Education Program has a ton of information about these practices that I've talked about, using cover crops and crop rotation, and how to use cover crops not just for the carbon sequestration, but also to help with insect pressure on the farm or help with weed management. And so for farmers, I think that's where I would start, is that USDA SARE program, and talk to your local extension agent about it. And just, there's so many resources out there now. It's really just about reaching out and going for them.
I think the resources that you mentioned, because we also want folks to find the guidance on how to do it. So, any other local guidance or trustworthy guidance or data that can support some of this transition that you could think of that you might want to mention to our audience?
Yeah, well, one thing about sustainable agriculture is that a lot of farmers get their information from those who are making sales. And so with sustainable agriculture, it is so much about knowledge. And that's where that USDA SARE program is important. Okay. And there are also programs in each state. So like Fort Valley has a program. The SARE program is active there. And I would go seek that out to find out more about events that are going on and, maybe funding that they have available. Those resources are those sustainable ag nonprofits, UGA Extension, and the USDA SARE program. And beyond that, there's a ton of stuff out there. It's just a matter of exploring and seeing which kind of model fits. There's models that include growing trees and food forests and silvopasture and all that I'm just not as familiar with. But those are great avenues to go down, because every farm is different. We all have different challenges and different land constraints. And so the solution for one person is going to be different from the solution for another.
Thank you so much for this, Daniel. This was so helpful. And like I said, I have a small backyard, and I have farming dreams. I don't know where they're going to go.
Grow your own. That's, the USDA food pyramid. I had a friend who said, well, let's change that and let's put the base of the food pyramid to be grow your own, and then buy from local growers, and then buy organic in the grocery store. And then, if you have to get conventional food from wherever, I love that's kind of the tip of the pyramid. But yeah, the grow your own is great, because again, like if you think about making change.
Yeah.
You've got less than 1% of our population who are actual farmers. I mean, it's very small group, but everybody eats. 100% of us are eaters. And so that's really, I think, the entry point to any kind of changes is looking at consumers and what we're doing. And, if you grow in your backyard, you're going to learn so much about it. And, when you go and talk to farmers at the farmers market, you can talk to them about what their practices are and all that. It's just a great way to kind of get into that local food space.
I'm going to ask you one more question. Our last question is my favorite question. What is giving you hope around climate in Georgia?
Oh, wow. Well, all the people doing good work on it is what's giving me hope. And so out here in Newton County, we have Sustainable Newton. They're very active and just like, Drawdown, Georgia and all that. I think there are a lot of people who are really working on it and we're making progress. And we'd love to see more progress, but progress is hope.
I like that. Progress is hope.
And we're growing a lot of food.
Yeah,
we've had a great year and an interesting weather year, and a lot of growers in the area have had a really great year of production. And so that's the other thing that gives me hope is just that we are able to produce so much food on a small amount of space and get it to people. So
thank you, Daniel Parson, once again for being with us today and talking to us about sustainable agriculture and organic farming and climate smart agriculture. And thank you all once again for joining us for this Georgia Climate Digest video series. And we will see you all next time. Thanks, Daniel.
Thank you.